welcome back to another episode of the Alter Your Health podcast, your source of information and inspiration to promote the holistic transformation of your health and the health of our planet. I'm your host, Dr. Benjamin Alter, and I'm really happy to be sharing this episode with you all today. I thought it was really one of the most enlightening and uplifting of the conversations I've had in a while, and that's saying a lot because, as you've known, if you are a listener, there's been some good stuff. So this one is right up there with the good stuff. I really enjoyed connecting with our guest today, and it was all about creating and cultivating alternative perspectives to life, and in doing so, it just brings freshness, brings creativity, it brings humor, and that's what our guest today has been working to provide the world for decades. So our guest today is Steve Bhaerman, an internationally known author, humorist, and workshop leader. For the past 23 years, he has written and performed as Swami Beyondananda, the cosmic comic. Swami's comedy has been called irreverently uplifting and has been described as both comedy disguised as wisdom and wisdom disguised as comedy. I would certainly agree with that. And as the Swami, Steve has authored a number of books, including Driving Your Own Karma, When You See a Sacred Cow, Milk It for All It's Worth, Duck Soup for the Soul, and Swami for President, a 7-step plan to heal the body politic and cure erectile dysfunction. So a little taste of his humor and his take on puns. In his past life, before he was Swami, Steve started an alternative high school in Washington, D.C. and co-authored a book about his experience, No Particular Place to Go, Making of a Free High School. A political science major, he later taught history to auto workers at Wayne State University in Detroit as part of the Weekend College. In 1980, Steve co-founded Pathways magazine in Ann Arbor, Michigan, one of the first publications bringing together holistic health, personal growth, spirituality, and politics. Subsequent to Pathways, Steve was a freelance writer and co-author with Don McMillan of Friends and Lovers, How to Meet the People You Want to Meet. Since 2005, Steve has written a political blog with spiritual perspective, Notes from the Trail, hailed as an encouraging voice in the bewilderness. His latest book, written with cellular biologist Bruce Lipton, is Spontaneous Evolution, Our Positive Future and a Way to Get There from Here. Steve is active in transpartisan politics and the practical application of spontaneous evolution. You can find more about Steve online at his website, wakeuplaughing.com. So Steve is also a host of a radio show that's available on podcasts, and that's Wiki Politiki, WIKIPOLITIKI.com for more information on that. And you can find more about Steve and all sorts of other stuff on alter.health/podcast. So really hope that you're able to laugh and enjoy and feel uplifted and find some perspective through listening to this episode with Steve Bhaerman. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Steve Bhaerman, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thanks for inviting me, Benjamin. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, like we were talking about, I know your life and how and what you do and how you bring cosmic comedy to the world, which is so refreshing in our world today. And I'd love for you to maybe just tell us a little bit more about how you have come into this space, your journey.
Well, it's been a long, strange trip, as they say. I started out in school, believe it or not, as a political science major. Although I have to say I never got quite so far as to actually dissect a politician. Never got to that far in poli-sci lab. And my first assignment really was Washington, D.C. I was teaching high school in Washington, D.C. during the late 60s and early 70s. Started an alternative school, and that got me started really examining the gap, let's call it the gap, between what we imagine we humans could be doing and what we actually are doing. And I thought I was having a serious career as a college professor. I was teaching ethnic studies and labor history at Wayne State University. But a funny thing happened. And sometimes when a funny thing happens, it's not that funny. It's just a twist and turn in the path. And I got laid off from my lovely teaching job, which I love, because they had to they had to find a place for their tenured people. And the only job I could find was doing tree work for the city of Ann Arbor, Michigan, taking down trees with Dutch elm disease. And it was fun during the summer, a job where you don't have to think very much and you can be outdoors and so on. But as it got to be winter in Michigan, things kind of got pretty bleak and dreary. And I remember sitting and working. I was working on a new book. I had written a book about education, about my experiences doing the free school, called No Particular Place to Go, Making of a Free High School. And now I was working on a sequel. I'd gone around and interviewed, after about 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years, my ex-students and what they had come to do in the world. And it was very interesting, but I couldn't find a publisher. And I'm thinking, this book is going to be my ticket out from putting on a jumpsuit every day and a hard hat and chipping brush all day. But the funny thing that happened was I heard a voice, and I don't usually hear voices unless they're embodied. Mm-hmm. And this voice said, let go of that project. It's the past. You need to focus on the future. I go, cool. What's the future? Nothing. But about 2 weeks later, I'm at work, and they put a new guy with me, Larry Kelsaw, who it turns out was a brilliant psychologist disguised as a truck driver. And Larry had studied neurolinguistic programming and all kinds of stuff. And after a couple of weeks, he said, hey, you're a writer. Let's start a newspaper. And we started a little funny publication for the guys that we work with at the shop. And this changed the entire course of my life, because in the process of creating humor every 2 weeks, watching the impact of how it opened people up, about how it allowed new ideas to come in under the radar, and how it disrupted and also gave us new ways of seeing things, I found my new calling. And so what I've been doing for the past 30 plus years is cosmic comedy in the guise of Swami Beyondananda. I don't do comedy clubs because I don't really feel that that's the ambiance that I'm looking for. I would much rather have an audience that is open, conscious, aware, and ready to deal with deeper ideas that get presented in the guise of comedy. So that's a short capsule of my journey for the last 30-something years.
Wow, that's pretty awesome. What strikes me is, well, certainly the voice that spoke to you in that moment, at least, and how interesting it was that it sounds like it was very clear, and yet when the second question arose, what do I do? There was nothing, so it was like the voice stirred you up and redirected you. But then in terms of what that was, it sounds like it was very much an unknown. Yeah, I'm curious, in those moments of unknown, how was it to just be kind of redirected?
Well, first, that's a really, really good question. First of all, I went, okay, and I let go of writing it, and kind of like when you stop banging your head on the wall, it feels good when you stop. So I was like, I had some relief there. And again, not knowing, more than ever before in our human history, particularly in civilization, in this Western civilization, it's very young. And we keep imagining that things can be known. We keep imagining that our little bubble, our little capsule of what middle-class existence has been for the last 100 years, let's say, is going to keep on going on forever. And there's so many factors working right now to explode us beyond that and really dismantle some of the structures that no longer work. I call them obsolete and obsolethal because they're deadly if we continue. So in that space, I was in the space of not knowing. I was curious. And when Larry Kelsaw approached me with this idea, I did it out of pure enjoyment. And my downstairs neighbor, Jill, used to come running up every now and then because Larry and I would be roaring with laughter and banging on the floor with all of the mischievous comedy that we were creating to disrupt the ordinary in this very muggly ordinary workplace.
Mm.
So the not knowing at that point, I mean, we're really all in that suspended animation about what's around the corner. Because think about it, if you absolutely knew, then what would be the fun or the purpose of actually living it? So part of the living it is being in the present, wherever we are, and allowing things to be the way they are until there's some other way. I was just, I do a radio show called Wiki Politicky, and my guest yesterday, Skylar Wilson, he and his wife and Matthew Fox, who is a very well-known theologian, have created something called the Order of the Sacred Earth. And it is a new non-religious spiritual order. And all you do is you simply take a vow to care for the earth, to be a caretaker for the earth. And, in the process of our conversation, we realized that we are living at a time when so much of the known is falling away. And what we have to gather around is the one certainty that there is, and that's the certainty of love, the certainty of universal love and coherence, that no matter what else is going on, that's the choice that we can make in every moment. So we're all in this space of not knowing. And one of the things that they talked about is ceremonies for grieving what we've lost. I mean, here in California, in Northern California, where I'm living, thousands of people have lost their home. At least 50 people have lost their lives. Nothing is going to be the same for the people who lost their home. Everything that they had, everything that they gathered, all of the important structures and things in their lives, literally up in smoke. And it takes kind of a true spiritual warrior to be able to work their way through that, and also to not prematurely go to trying to fix the problem, but literally to be with acceptance of it the way it is. And I think we always want to fix things, and so we skip over that process of grieving what's been lost and being with that, and forgetting that there's a lot of richness in that experience as well.
Yeah, that's so true. And what's sticking with me in what you're saying is, and we can talk more about it, this idea that in the unknown and in the kind of chaos, maybe, that's really potentially where there's a lot of fun and excitement, because like you said, what fun is it if we know where we're going, if we know what we're doing? I mean, I think about, watching a great movie. Yeah. What makes a movie great is the unknown.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
And as uncomfortable as it feels in these times, what I'm hearing you say is really trying to, cultivate a way of trusting, and also a way of just making light of whatever sort of challenge that we might be faced with. So that being said, I mean, do you have any keys to make light of challenge?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important that we begin with ourselves. And, again, if somebody says to you, you should laugh at your problems, then it's kind of like somebody saying, why did you create this? Well, you're then justified in hitting him upside the head and saying, why did you create that? Mm-hmm. So really what it is we begin with ourselves. And if we make the choice to find the joke hidden in the picture, to go, okay, what is the hidden joke here? Sometimes it's not a funny joke, but sometimes the joke, which is really a paradox, which is really something that you can take out of the situation and go, this is a new perspective. This gives me new space to think differently. So as an example, this fire, the big fire that we're breathing in smoke in Santa Rosa, where I live, started in paradise. Paradise was destroyed. Paradise burned down. Okay, so I think that there's a very interesting irony in that we people in this country have, in a certain sense, created paradise compared to how the vast majority of humanity lives around the planet. And we think that our little bubble is how life is. And I think part of it, when paradise gets disrupted, when our idea of a perfect world gets disrupted, then it's time to go, well, what was missing in that perfect world? So part of finding the joke hidden in the picture is that, well, when paradise burns, then what? What are we left with? We're still left with the love in our heart. We're still left with the relationship with the people that we have and the things that we really value. I've met people who've had their houses burned down and say, that's the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm going, right. But they mean it, because what happened was it destroyed a structure that paradoxically was keeping them very comfortable and also was in the way of their growth, because you want to perpetuate the sameness of something that feels good and seems to be working. You know, so even my wife Trudy and I are thinking about, well, here we are. We love being in Santa Rosa, California, and it might be that for a period of time, this smoke is the new normal. And the things I love to do, like be outside and hike, I'm a bit compromised in being able to do that. So part of looking at where's the joke hidden? Yeah, what's the joke hidden in the picture? The other thing that humor does is it gives us a different perspective. And people go, it's interesting that jokes always have threes: a minister, a priest, and a rabbi. Okay, so minister, priest, and a rabbi are discussing their legacy. How do they want to be remembered? What do they want the eulogist to be saying when they're laying in their casket? And the minister says, well, I want them to be saying he was a family man and a pillar of his community. The priest said, I want people to be saying he was a holy man and a leader of his flock. The rabbi says, I want people to be saying, look, I think he's breathing. So humor, a joke, is a way of taking unrelated things and putting them together in a surprising and delightful way that creates a new connection and offers us a new perspective on looking at things, because we are in a very polarized world. We're in a world of it's this way or it's that way. It's black or white. You're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're with us, you're against us. And then all of a sudden the joke very quietly insinuates a different way of looking at things. Here's a real life example of how that works. So a number of years ago, I was doing a presentation at a health conference, and I was talking about a disease we have in our body politic called irony deficiency. Irony. We fail to see the ironies, and so comedians get to pump ironies, bring them to exaggeration so that everybody could recognize, oh, that's ironic. That's a paradox. That's an oxymoron. And so one of the I say that seeing a doctor won't help, but seeing a paradox will. So one of the stories, the example I gave at that time was people who called themselves pro-life, and yet they believe in the death penalty. I thought that was paradoxical. A woman comes up to me afterward, and she's very angry at me because she's obviously with the anti-abortion faction, and she's very upset that I use this as an example. So I decide I'm going to tell her a story, and she doesn't know I'm telling her a story. I said, well, I was watching TV, and there were three spiritual leaders discussing when life begins: a minister, a priest, and a rabbi. And the priest said, life begins at conception. And she says, yes, that's what I believe. Doesn't know I'm telling her a joke. And the minister said, life begins when the baby takes the first breath. She's shaking her head now. And then they said, Rabbi, when does life begin? He says, life begins when the children leave home and the dog dies. And this woman burst out laughing, and she hugged me. Because two things happened. First of all, the joke broke the trance of this or that separation. It created an absurd third way that sparked her playfulness, made her laugh. And what happens when we laugh is we leave the dueling dualities of the head for the unity of the heart. Hearty laughter puts us in the heart. There's no separation. It breaks the trance of the mind. And so what happened was she was completely disarmed, and she forgot temporarily that we disagreed about something. And because the joke tickled her so much, she was able to lose that. And I think that we have, not everything can be joked about. There's tragedies that are so painful, you have to really go through the tragedy fully and experience that before you've earned the right to make a joke about it. It was 20 years from the end of World War II to the time that Mel Brooks could do the movie The Producers, Springtime for Hitler, and make a joke about that. It took 20 years before that could happen, before there was enough perspective to go, yes, I think we're big enough now to laugh at that.
Right. Yeah, I could really appreciate that. It's really hitting home for me because I feel like I can be in any situation and really be stubborn and determined to find a way through and just very rigid in my thinking. Yeah. And I know that there is an alternative aspect of myself that's more light and humorous and joy-filled. And I know that if I can only access that for a minute and get out of my rigid intellectual thinking and into my heart and my body, I know that I will find a solution that's more graceful. And yet that switch, which is prompted like that in that example with a humorous joke or an interaction, that switch can be really difficult for me to make, if without you being present and making light of the situation. It's hard for me to make light of my own situations.
Here's a bit of coaching on that, because I do teach, I do coaching to help people humorize their lives in an appropriate way. And one of the things I recommend is cultivating an alter ego.
Well, my last name's Alter, so that shouldn't be a problem.
Yes, yeah, exactly. You're in an altered state from birth.
I was meant for this job.
There you go. Now, see, that's where humor begins, when you begin to make these free associations. Now, a lot of people, I met somebody many years ago, whose last name was Gross, who had never heard the term grossed out. Because people were kind to him, they want to share that with. But you're already you already have taken a step. Now, when you're able to the idea about cosmic comic consciousness is the ability to separate temporarily from the situation and become an observer. And then when you become the observer, you're looking at the situation and go, what's funny about this? Sometimes you need the help of a different personality inside of you. And the different personality could be somebody that's totally the opposite of the way you are, or it could be an exaggeration of the way that you really are. So one way to go would be to find somebody who is really create an alter ego that is you amped up by a factor of 10. That is so determined, that is so focused, that is so single-mindedly railroading over everything. You're kind of like this train.
That doesn't sound too far from the truth. Yeah.
or you can have an alter ego that is totally the opposite. Where you're just like da da da.
That kind of sounds like my wife.
Yeah, that's why you're with her, But what if you changed roles? What if she became you and you became her?
Yeah. That would be humorous.
That would be humorous. And what it would be reflecting back to you an exaggeration of that character that you take on when you want to create safety and control. And we all know how ridiculous the idea of control is. It's like, what makes God laugh hearing our plans? So the idea of, we think we're in control of so many things, and it's totally ridiculous, that we're not. We are in control of how we respond to our situations, although even that is subject to the way we've been trained and programmed. So if you were to look at, okay, here I am, I know that I'm in this, I'm facing a situation, I'm looking for solutions, I'm impatient, And by the way, when they gave out patience, I didn't get any because I got tired of waiting in line. So
Yeah,
I missed that.
I missed it with you. I
Yeah.
was in the same line.
Yeah, and there's certain thing about the masculine, how the masculine energy is programmed. Don't just stand there, do something. Interestingly enough, when pilots are trained, and this is how Sully, the pilot who landed that jet on the Hudson River a few years ago, this is how he did it. The way that pilots are trained, when you're in the midst of disaster or pending disaster, you know what the first thing you do is? Nothing. You do nothing. You do nothing. You create that space of silence that allows you to take a breath, because breathing is the key to long life, as we know. We want to keep breathing always. So it allows you to take that breath. And in taking that breath, all of a sudden you have access to resources that you don't have when you're not breathing. Humor works the same way as an intervention. So my wife, Trudy, and I have these interventions that we do through humor. When I get into my grumpy self and so on, she'll say, "Could you send that other guy into the room, please?" The other guy is the part of me that's not like that. And it's a gentle way of pointing out something that's real, peripherally. It's not a direct confrontation. It's indirect. Humor is indirect. And as you've probably discovered, when you try to push against and resist something, that whatever that is pushes back and creates more resistance. If you find a peripheral way around that, something that doesn't confront it directly, but also makes your point and creates an opening, then you have the possibility of something new happening. One more example. I've been married to Trudy. We've been married now 32 years. And, of course, I totally adore her. But after 32 years, there's always these qualities that drive you absolutely crazy, right? And so the thing about her is that she's always the last one out of everything. We're the last people to leave. I want to drive home. I'm tired. We're the last people to leave. And so it gets irritating. And, and we have an interspecies marriage. I'm a dog and she's a cat. Totally interspecies. And so, we want to go somewhere. I got the leash in my mouth, like, where she's just kind of getting ready. So we're off to go hiking in our favorite place. And one of the mistakes I make with her is I forget to keep her in front of me. Because if I get in front of her, then I'm out and she's in. Okay, so I got to keep her in front of me and just kind of keep things moving. So I'm already sitting in the car and I realize, she's not coming. And I start to get irritated. I know you probably get that too, where you start to get a little irritation, And I went, okay, find the joke hidden in the picture. I couldn't. I was resisting it. Finally, not that moment. Finally, I go, So I walk back into the house, and there she is, getting ready. And I say, Trudy, I've been waiting for you my whole life. And you're certainly worth waiting for. And in that moment, and telling the truth in kind of a double meaning kind of way, I've been waiting for you. I've been waiting for you my whole life. I said something, and then I took away the takeaway by saying, and you're certainly worth waiting for. And what happened was we went off and had a great time instead of the argument that we were going to have.
That's a great kind of routine example of how a little bit of perspective can be woven into any sort of daily, ordinary situation. Yeah, love that. Yeah, what's coming to me is just, this idea of all we need to do is just for the slightest instant, just create a little bit of space between where we're at tangled up emotionally and what is actually happening.
That's exactly right. Yes.
And it seems like humor is one thing that can create that pretty consistently, as long, as long as it's around, which you would probably say that, humor is always around. But, once again, for someone like me, it's like, where is it? But I've got some good tips for finding humor in situations that might not be humorous. I like the idea of creating the alter ego, or just kind of blowing things out of proportion. Any other?
Yeah, well, I want to say something about that as well, that everything has its toxic opposite. So, I was one of those people. I grew up I spent my deformative years in New York and a housing project, and I used humor as a weapon and a shield. It was a way for me to protect myself. When older kids would ask me for money, when I was 8 years old, I learned to say, hey, look, I live here. If I had money, would I be living here? And they would laugh and leave me alone. So I always use humor, but then I was also one of those people who used it to keep intimacy away. And we've all experienced people who will make a joke about everything.
Yeah.
No matter what.
The self-deprecating kind of jokes, or is that what you're saying?
Or insulting other people.
Okay.
Or just taking humor, something that you don't want to deal with. And so you just kind of, somebody's trying to tell you that you're difficult to communicate with. I remember my first year teaching in Washington, D.C., fresh from Brooklyn. One of the other teachers saw a comment that I wrote on a student's paper. And he said, boy, that's mean. I said, no, that's not mean. It's funny. He said, no, that's mean. And it took me a few years to disarm, to take the armor off that I used, and humor was my way of keeping that armor on, to prevent other people from, to prevent myself from being vulnerable to being hurt. As a kid, it was physical, but then later on, it's emotional. And so I've learned, because my mind works, I can't help but think of jokes. I cannot help but think of it. So I developed a routine. I'll come home from something and I'll tell Trudy, I'll say, I was a good boy. And she'll say, oh, what didn't you say? And then I will tell her the joke that came to mind that was totally inappropriate for that particular situation, that would have either insulted or hurt somebody, or that would have disrupted an intimate conversation that did not need to be disrupted. Certain conversations need disruption. Humor is the perfect way to disrupt. The habitual conversation that's sort of on the battlefield and not going anywhere. If it lifts us off the battlefield to where we both can see, oh, what silly geese we are arguing about a stupid thing like that, then that's enlightenment. If somebody is trying to communicate something that is intimate, that has to do with a vulnerable feeling that they have, that has to do with something that they want you to hear about themselves or about yourself, and you're using humor to defend, that's an inappropriate use of the tool. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it does seem like a pretty fine subtlety. I could see, I could see maybe a conflict where there's somebody who is using humor as armor, but maybe trying to escape the situation, trying to elevate the situation, and it's perceived as, immaturity or whatever other kind of, argument. Yeah. So it does seem like a subtlety. And what I'm hearing is that the authentic motivation of where you're coming from in the humor is really what's important.
Exactly right. And I think that's where, let's call it political correctness, where I think it's a cop-out. I think it's really destroyed communication. It's a way to pretend that you're not insulting. You want to really insult somebody, but you hold your tongue because, but you keep it inside, and it really isn't out there. When you, I mean, let's imagine it's a high school, and there's been very insulting and hurtful speech. Let's say it's about girls, it's about women. And instead of saying, you can't say that, creating a high school assembly where people really speak their hearts, and you get to hear people say, I was hurt by that. And you get to really have to experience their vulnerability, and you have to then reflect, have the cognitive dissonance of, wow, I didn't really mean to hurt that person. I didn't want to be hurtful. I was simply trying to express myself, and I didn't realize, what if that was my sister or my mother or somebody that I really cared for who was hurt, who was verbally bullied, and so on. And at the same time, it's really important to work with overly sensitive people to cultivate a sense of perspective so they don't take things poisonally. Because my joke is that, if you do a transpartisan event with Democrats and Republicans, the Republicans need to learn sensitivity training, and the Democrats need to learn insensitivity training. So that you're less sensitive to these things, and you take the victim position a lot less, and then you actually cultivate personal power for yourself, because your goat is not a gettable goat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. So you spoke earlier about, I guess you were at a conference speaking about health.
Yes.
From a cosmic comedy perspective. So how would you say that cosmic comedy influences one's health, or maybe global health?
Well, I think that one of the great gifts that we got was a book back in, I think, probably the late 1970s called Anatomy of an Illness. And Norman Cousins, who was a writer, very interesting guy, by the way, long conversation about Norman Cousins. He was actually a go-between in secret negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev in the 1960s. But he was a writer, and he was diagnosed with, basically, he was given a death sentence with an illness. And instead of going to the hospital, he checked into a hotel room with candid camera reruns and Marx Brothers movies, and he got well. And when he cured himself, he wrote this book called Anatomy of an Illness. And at that point, the medical establishment began to study the healing power of laughter. This is only about 35 or 40 years ago. And of course, my joke is, it's kind of like, well, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? But when they studied the physiology of laughter, they found several things. They found that laughter increases the hormones called endorphins, are natural painkillers. Laughing improves immune function as well. Laughter lowers the blood pressure because laughter causes our blood vessels to dilate. And of course, the Swami's joke is, and that's better than having them die early, right?
Die early, yeah.
Yeah. However, on a more emotional, mental, and spiritual level, humor gives us perspective. Years ago, before I met my wife, I wrote a book with a psychologist called Friends and Lovers, How to Meet the People You Want to Meet. And we interviewed many people about how they met their life partner and so on, and what they were looking for. And what I was very interested in, I noticed that so many people wrote that one of the qualities that they're looking for in a mate or partner is sense of humor. And it's not like you want to be with the person who wears the lampshade on their head. But the sense of humor is really a sense of perspective. It's a sense of resiliency. It's a way to become more resilient. It's a way to bounce back. There was a study done at a medical center in Chicago about 30 years ago. And the study was that people who worked in the emergency room and worked in the burn unit and worked with horrific things, The people who were not able to use what they call graveyard humor to release the tension of that situation burned out and had to leave. So if you're around people that work in fire department or EMS or burn unit or ER, if you were to overhear some of their conversations, you'd be shocked. But this shocking humor is something that they use to release the stress and tension, to metabolize that and create a fresh space so that they can be present with whatever else comes in. So that's a very extreme example of how humor is used.
Yeah, well, I really like that example because, you know, what first came to me when I asked the question is, and when you started giving your answer, is that humor really does seem like the antidote to a stressful situation, a stressful environment. You know, you bring some of that in and your physiology responds in kind of a way opposite of stress, which is healing. And what comes to another question that comes to mind for me is, you know, are there actual exercises to maybe increase one's sense of humor? Do you think that being exposed to humor, watching comedies, going, you know, speaking with funny people, do you think that someone's sense of humor can evolve and change and grow over time under the right circumstances?
Absolutely. You know, it's kind of like learning how to ride a bike. First time you get on the bike, you're clumsy. You can't imagine how one keeps their balance with all of this stuff. And as you learn to do it, it becomes second nature. My wife, Trudy, grew up in a German household. She likes to say it was Germanic depressive. And she didn't grow up with a sense of humor. It wasn't until she had met her first Jewish boyfriend that she began to recognize what it was. And she practiced. She practiced telling jokes. She actually began to recognize that there's a certain narrative, there's a certain way that you tell a joke, that a joke is like a mini trance state where you put somebody in a trance of where they narrow their focus of attention. You want to hear the joke because you know there's going to be a reward, a punchline at the end.
The endorphins, kind of like the
exactly.
Yeah.
And also the dopamine rush that you get when you laugh at a joke is a lot like the dopamine rush you get when you solve a problem, because joke is a problem. How do you fit these two things together? You know, how do you fit these two unrelated ideas together? And when you get the answer, you're as delighted as a baby is playing peekaboo, which is really, it's all peekaboo. Now you see it, now you don't. The punchline is invisible until it's revealed, you know. So there's a lot of magic in humor. So if your idea is really good, if you immerse yourself in humor, if you allow yourself to be surrounded by humor, if you allow yourself to be curious about how humor shows up, if you put yourself around people who are funny, and instead of trying to compete with them, because there's no point in that, simply pay attention, simply notice how their mind is working in free association, and your mind will begin to work that way as well. The problem with humor, the thing that stops people the most, is trying to be funny. If somebody comes up to me, a stranger, and says, "Hey, make me laugh," my first impulse, which I don't follow, is to slug him in the jaw. I don't do that.
That would be funny, though.
For some. You know, that reminds me of when I was a kid. One of my favorite comedy albums was Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks, The 2,000-Year-Old Man. And Mel Brooks was a 2,000-year-old man who has seen everything, and Carl Reiner is a straight man. And he says, and the 2,000-year-old man, because it was Mel Brooks, spoke in a Jewish accent and so on. And so he says, now, well, tell us, what was the first joke? And 2,000-year-old man said, well, the first joke. Well, one day a lion walks into the cave, and Murray, the jokester, the prankster, takes the lion by the tail, goes, yah-ha, over the shoulder. The lion gets up and eats Murray. Did we laugh?
That's making light of the situation.
Yeah, but you see, and Mel Brooks is, he's a great, he says, uh, uh, tragedy is when I stub my toe. Comedy is when you fall down an open sewer and drown. So that, that's an extreme way of saying that it's a lot easier to laugh at something out there. So in a certain regard, situation comedies are a vehicle for teaching Buddhism, because Buddhism says that life is suffering, and suffering comes from attachment to outcome, attachment to income. So you take any situation comedy from I Love Lucy through Seinfeld to anything that you're seeing on the air, whatever we're looking at now. What happens is all of the characters are attached to having an outcome, and we're laughing because they're thwarted, and we're laughing because it's happening to somebody else, because there's a laugh track, and because it's exaggerated. But we're seeing a mirror. Of course, it's a exaggerated mirror that's looking at our human situation and the ego in a way that is painting a caricature of the ego. And if we only get to look at that caricature and see, oh, that's me, only exaggerated, then we get to learn something, and we get a degree of separation from our, let's say, enslavement to our own ego, to our desires, to our desire to control, to our, I would say, societally programmed selfishness. Because again, in indigenous cultures, there was a connection with everything else. There's a connection. I'm not separate from the world. But we have, in this so-called civilization, have been living through this delusion that we're separate from everything else. And so now we are. If we're looking at what's going on with the weather, well, we separated ourselves from the web of life. We've separated our endeavors from things that are going to be woven in and symbiotic with survival and thrival in that world.
Yeah. What's really important, I hear about what you're saying, is how it's so much easier to make light of something that's happening outside of ourselves into someone else. And that's, I'm realizing that's why I feel like whenever I sit down to watch a movie, I want it to be something funny, so I can kind of make light of something outside of my own situation. Not that I'm living a super duper dreary life or anything, but there is like a craving to, maybe it's those endorphins, maybe, and that's just something interesting that I'm taking note of in my world. And I could imagine that a lot of people relate. And the other thing that I want to touch on in the last moments here is, given our crazy chaotic environment, politically, environmentally, the world that we're living in, do you have any tools or skills or keys or recommendations for making light of what really is kind of a serious situation? So,
well, I find it's a survival thing for me.
Yeah.
And I do it to of course I entertain other people with it, but I do it to entertain myself. Because, I look at it as metabolizing the residue of 5,000 years of rule by the lowest common denominator. So sometimes a joke can provide perspective as well as laughter, sometimes as an aha in the wake of the ha-ha. So part of what I do with the Swami is sometimes the humor is quite ironic, but it points out the contradictions. It brings the contradictions to consciousness so that we can look at them. And my humor is kind of, it can be very confrontatory, like the difference between the two political parties. Republicans bend over backwards for the bankers and special interests. Democrats, completely opposite, they bend over forward. It's very easy to make jokes about Donald Trump, People say that that he isn't acting like an adult, and of course, the Swami says that's ridiculous. He's committed countless adulterous acts. So when you're able to do that, it makes you feel better. Just like when people are able to joke about their own situation. I'd say that one of the most stark examples of that, Viktor Frankl, in his book Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about being in a Nazi death camp during World War II. Seriously, he and a fellow inmate made an agreement. Every day, they would find something to laugh about. Because if they were able to keep that perspective, there was a part of them that could not be captured. It kept their spirit alive. Their spirit could not be destroyed with humor. And to give you an idea of the power and leverage that this provided, there's actually a book called Laughter in Hell, Humor and the Holocaust, which talks first about how Hitler was so scared of the cabaret comedians because they had the power to break the trance, that those are the first people he put in jail. The second thing had to do with the use of humor inside the concentration camps. And one of the jokes that actually circulated among the inmates involved these two Jewish guys who decide they're going to assassinate Hitler. And they know Hitler's motorcade is going to pass this certain intersection at 11 in the morning, and they're waiting for him. 11 in the morning, he doesn't show up. 11:15, he's not there. 11:30, still not there. He's not there by 11:45. One of the assassins turns to the other and says, "Gee, I hope nothing's happened to him." So that's the power that humor has to become bigger than your situation. If you're able to use humor to get a perspective that's higher and deeper, that's bigger, that puts things in perspective, that this too shall pass, that I am bigger than this situation. Who I am is bigger than this situation. The power of love is bigger than anything that can happen to me. That is something that humor, not the only tool in the toolkit, but that's something that humor can provide. Plus, the laughter provides the necessary relief to put people in a state where they can come up with creative solutions in that space.
Yeah, I think that's maybe most important of all. I think that societally, we're really locked in, maybe a lot like how I function on my normal basis, kind of locked in to find the solution and work hard and, just kind of trudge through. But in order to really create in order to find a creative, sustainable solution, we need to, like, on an individual level, the same is true. We need to create that space and elevate the perspective and look at things in a new direction. And humor does that. And I think it's important, this has been a great conversation for me personally, because I think I've always kind of thought, oh, well, if I just make light of this situation, I'm being immature, I'm being dismissive, I'm not taking things seriously, I don't care. But when in actuality, it is caring, because I'm able to bring myself, like I said, to that new perspective and actually create some real solutions and make some real headway in life.
Here's a story from the 60s. A very famous and well-known ad agency, this is like the mid-1960s, had a very challenging job. A Japanese company, I think it was Toyota, were trying to make inroads in the United States. And at that point, Japan there were two issues. First of all, it was only 20 years after the end of World War II. They had bombed Pearl Harbor, there had been a war with these people. And then secondly, made in Japan in those days was a lot like made in China now. It was a sign of lack of quality. And so here are these, brilliant ad guys trying to figure out, how do you present this Japanese company to America? And they were getting nowhere, and they're getting frustrated, they're getting angry, and there's tension. Finally, one guy raises his hand and he says, "Hey, I got an idea. How about from those wonderful folks who brought us Pearl Harbor?" And everybody burst out laughing because it was so absurd that, of course, they're not going to do that. But in that laughter, it released the tension to the point where they could actually begin thinking about the problem. And I think that's really the benefit of humor. It's not avoidance. It's radical acceptance. It's a way of radically accepting what there is. And in that space of acceptance, through laughter, in the wake of the aha, of the ha-ha, there's an aha and there's an ah, as we leave the duality of the head for the unity of the heart. And from there, we can find something.
I love that. I love how humor is not avoidance, it's radical acceptance. And I love the ha-ha, aha.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of really sums it up right there, doesn't it?
It does. And again, it's not the cure-all for everything, because some people are too hurt and damaged to appreciate jokes, particularly if they feel it's directed against them. So part of this is if you make the humor about yourself, you're always safe. And I'm not talking about insulting humor about yourself. I'm talking about like Abraham Lincoln. We have one last example. He's in a debate and his opponent calls him two-faced. And Lincoln said, "If I had two faces, would I be using this one?" Very disarming.
Yeah, love that. One question that's just lastly coming to mind, and I wish we brought it up before, but Swami Beyondananda, how did that come to be? Where did that name come from? What was the inspiration? And yeah,
I like to say I got struck by lightning during a brainstorm. When I was writing my paper for the forestry workers, this name flew into my head. Now, I'd done some meditation. I knew that all the Swamis, Yogananda, Muktananda, Satchidananda, they all had Ananda. Beyondananda. It just flew into my head and I laughed. When a couple of years later, I started this Pathways magazine, we realized that we needed humor for people who are involved in personal growth and spirituality and holistic health. And my partner in that venture and I decided that Swami Beyondananda would be our kind of our mascot. And so we started doing a Swami column in every paper, and it was the most popular feature. We did like spoofs of ads like "Teach your dog to heal because dogs are natural healers," everything you always want to know about sects, religious sects, and so on. Mm-hmm. And people liked it. And when I decided that I was going to do humor as a full-time gig, the Swami character presented itself to me, and I look at it as a gift that's been given. It's not, people from India recognize I'm not making fun of them. I'm not, and they recognize that I'm really using this as a vehicle for spreading humor and wisdom. The idea of the Swami is that the Swami has wisdom and insight, and humor is the extra benefit. I've never had anybody from India or Indian descent take umbrage at what I'm doing. Of course, other people who are toxically politically correct have had their say about it, and I think that they've really missed the point. Something you said earlier that really makes a difference here is the manner and mood that the humor is delivered. Is it open-hearted? Mm-hmm. Is it open-hearted? Is it designed to bring people together, or is it designed to create separation? That's the question. So if you're thinking, should I go forward with this, ask what your motivation is.
Yeah, I think that's really important wisdom to touch on every time we open our mouth, really. If only we were all doing that, right? If only we were all connected with that. Well, Swami Beyondananda, Steve Bhaerman, where can listeners find out more about where you are, what you're up to,
Well, for the cosmic comedy, Swami's website is wakeuplaughing.com. Wake Up Laughing. Swami has books and CDs and all kinds of stuff. My radio show, which is a little bit more serious, but not that much more, is called Wiki Politiki. WIKIPOLITIKI. wikipolitiki.com. And we've got archived shows dating back a year. So our intention with that is to bring right and left, front and center, to face the music and dance together.
Yeah, I love that because really I think that this conversation has really been great for me personally, and I can so understand now more so how comedy is so popular in the world, because we do live in a world that's really kind of stressful, and comedy is the antidote. It's like the balance. And thank you for bringing it. And
Well,
balance.
thank you for asking for it and for helping people just begin. If you immerse yourself in comedy, the comedy that you love, something that made you laugh. What made you laugh when you were a kid, when you were in your 20s, when you were in your 30s? What made you laugh last week? Find that and do that more, because when you bring yourself above the line, it helps everybody you're around.
Love that. Well, thank you, Swami.
Okay.
And
thank you so much, Benjamin.
Yeah,
And
it's been real.
as a Swami would say, namaste and namaste go. Goodbye.
Goodbye.